This week, we're going to review Chapter 2, Theories and Research. Theories and research have similarities in all disciplines, but there are always foundational principles that relate to specific areas. In this case, we are discussing human growth and development. The theories and research presented here are foundational to the study of growth and development and will be continued throughout the semester. Let's begin by reviewing your learning objectives this week. Describe the purpose of theories in research and two theoretical issues on which developmental scientists differ. Summarize the main theories of human development. Describe the methods developmental researchers use to collect data and the advantages and disadvantages of each. And explain ethical guidelines for researchers. By exploring the important underlying issues and theoretical perspectives, it is easier to follow the research and even identify potential gaps in research. It is also important to address ethical issues in research. While we now have in place protections for human subjects research, prior standards have at times failed us, and there has been research that is considered unethical. Through our study and practice, we hope to never repeat those practices again. I have often heard students say their theory class was a waste of time and no one uses it in their career. I cringe every time I hear it, and I think that their professors failed them. Theory is a framework that is necessary for well-conceived research. In human growth and development, theory is the set of logically related concepts that seeks to organize, explain, and predict the data, and thus the human behavior in which we are interested. You will learn that there are theories commonly used by nurses. You will hear about them throughout your education. If you don't know already, you will also learn that scientists produce theories. Think of theories as binding together a scale model and a theoretical hypothesis so it reflects the real world. For our theory to be true, which is what we want, it must reflect the real world. While it is speculation about the real world, it is our best effort at truth. Obviously, we want to know how the theory will be supported by the evidence. We then want data to decide whether the model we have fits the evidence we get through an experiment. If you learn these foundational theories, it will be easier for you to remember the information presented throughout the semester because it gives you a framework in your brain for categorizing information in a way that makes sense and helps you to connect the different pieces of information presented. Theories and hypotheses are connected in research. The theory is what we use to imagine the research we want to do, to answer questions and fill gaps. The hypothesis is a possible explanation for a phenomena that is used to predict the outcome of the research. In research in growth and development, we will proceed with two assumptions. Are people active or reactive in their development? And development is either continuous or occurs in stages. Whichever assumption you use will impact your research. John Locke was a 17th century philosopher and physician who is known for his theory of mind and is credited for the conception of identity in the self. He said that a young child is a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. This is an important concept for you to remember because how a child develops is dependent on their experiences. Imagine a child as a whiteboard. I wish we had a whiteboard online so that we could imagine a child and think of the ways society writes that child's future. If the child has loving parents, the value of it and that value education, what might the child grow up to be? What if a parent is killed in war and the other parent flees the country as a refugee and spends years in a refugee camp? How does that impact the child and what they will be? Take 5 minutes and call a classmate or talk to your parents or siblings. Can you name some positive or negative experiences you think could impact a child? What might have sent you down a different path than attending college? Be sure to identify both positive and negative experiences and how they come from people you have known, news stories, or biographies. Now that we're back and you've completed that assignment, let's move on to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was an 18th century philosopher who believed that children are born noble savages and develop their own positive tendencies if they are not corrupted by society. This may be a slight overstatement of his views. He did not believe the savage stage was the first stage of development. He did not think morality came from society teaching it, but was natural. The result today is that we have two approaches to human development, active and reactive. In reactive development, humans are seen as hungry sponges soaking up experiences that shape them over time, whereas reactive people create experiences because they are motivated to learn. It is not passively happening to them, but rather they are intentionally involved in the process. One way to think of this is playing sports. How might you imagine how to learn to play basketball from an active or a reactive perspective? Take a little time and think this through before progressing. Which do you prefer, tabula rasa or noble savage, active or reactive development? Can you say why? The mechanistic view is based on Locke's view of reaction to the environment. We do not necessarily have free will, but are reactive beings. In this view, if we understand human biology and how the human machine works, we can predict behavior. Shoemaker believed that in the mechanistic worldview, individuals are merely functioning like machines to the world around them. They do not create the world, they just simply respond to the world. We aren't commander data yet, but human behavior functions like machines. There was an interesting story that I found online by a woman whose name is Ruth Esperanza. And she endured violence and abuse at the hands of her father. As a result of her environment, she basically married a man with the same characteristics of her father. So she went from an abusive household and an abusive father to an abusive husband. Esperanza's life is an example of how life was created for her. She did not create her life, but rather reacted to the world around her. She responded just like a machine. And she recreated the family environment in which she grew up. The organismic view is based on Rousseau's and holds that we set our own destiny through active action. The organismic view of humans is that they are reactive agents, making choices that are oriented towards their future. Individuals control their own lives. So if you take the same woman later in Ruth, in her life, she became an active agent by taking control of her life. And she leaves the abusive husband and becomes associated with a group of women who were not socially accepted. This basically shows that she was able to change her life and to make her own decisions. So in the mechanistic view, people react to their environment. It's not on one's own will, but in reaction. If we understand the biology, we can predict behaviors. So researchers might look for cultural influences. And again, John Locke was the forerunner of this view. The organismic view sees people as active, growing organisms that make their own destiny through actions. Their development has an orderly structure, though it isn't necessarily obvious. Behavior isn't just a response to the environment, and Rousseau was the forerunner of this model. Why is the distinction between development being continuous or discontinuous important? If you take a mechanistic view, we are more like machines. We see development as being gradual in incremental steps. So, in this view, you might suspect that you grow in incremental steps. In height, your body grows, but your vocabulary grows. As you get bigger, you have more words. As you get older, you get bigger, and still yet more words. So, taller, you weigh more, and you have bigger vocabularies. A different approach of viewing development is that of the organismic view. And those theorists are focused on stage theories. Each stage is different. While each stage is different, they build on each other so that you can't skip a stage as you might skip steps running up them. Another way to think of this is you can't go from first base to home. If we look at this in a different approach, then what we might see is steps you have to climb. You can't just have a gap in the steps and take the next one. You have to have an incremental approach, something that bridges all of those gaps. So it's the difference between continuous is gradual and incremental, discontinuous is abrupt and uneven. You have quantitative change. These are changes in number and amount, such as height, weight, size, vocabulary, and communication, and you have qualitative changes, discontinuous changes in kind, structure, and organization. One way to approach organizing the different theories is to use the 5 perspectives of psychoanalytic, learning, cognitive, contextual, and evolutionary. Within each of these perspectives, you can insert the relevant theorist. For example, psychoanalytic includes Freud's psychosexual theory and Erikson's psychosocial theory. Let's walk through this, and you can find this in your book in Table 2.1. Psychoanalytic theory has 2 important theorists, Freud and Erikson. You are going to hear a lot about these theories through the course of the semester. The psychosexual theory of Freud is that behavior is controlled by powerful unconscious urges. Erikson's psychosocial theory is that personality is influenced by society and develops through a series of crises. Next, we'll cover learning theory. The two important theorists here for us are Pavlov, Skinner, Watson, and Bandura. Pavlov, Skinner, and Watson are all behaviorism and traditional learning theory. They see people are responders and the environment controls behavior. Bandura was social learning or social cognitive theory, and he thought children learn by observation and imitation. They are active contributors to learning. In the cognitive theory, we have Piaget, Vygotsky, and then information processing theory. Piaget's cognitive theory we will also cover a lot throughout the semester. It is that qualitative changes in thought occur between infancy and adolescence. Children are active initiators of development. Vygotsky thought social interaction is central to cognitive development, and then the information process theory sees human beings are processors and manipulators of symbols. And we will explain later on what the symbols means. Then the contextual theory is Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory. In this theory, the basic proposition is that development occurs through interaction between a developing person and 5 interlocking contextual systems of influence. And finally, the evolutionary or sociological theory. And the proposition here is that human beings are the product of adaptive processes. There is an evolutionary basis for behavior and learning. Let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. So the first perspective we will discuss is psychoanalytic. Freud was the first of the 2 psychoanalytic theories that will be covered. He believed we have 3 parts of our personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is about pleasure. As newborns, we want pleasure and we want immediate gratification. I'm hungry, feed me now. It is the pleasure center. The ego is a little more rational and will work to find ways to gratify the id. It begins to develop in the first year of life. By the time one is 5 to 6 years old, the superego is developing. It's the part of our personality that knows right from wrong, should from should not, and can make us feel anxious and guilty. Freud saw the ego as a mediator or referee between the id and the superego. The internal battle can cause conflicts, and you will hear a lot about some of those conflicts as the semester goes along. The stages of the psychosexual development are oral, which is related around the mouth. It involves sucking, swallowing, and people that don't successfully get through this stage might be nail biters and smokers. The anal focuses on the anal, withholding and expelling feces. People that don't successfully get through this stage might be obsessively clean, rigid to schedule, or defiantly messy. The phallic stage is about the penis and the clitoris and masturbation. This is the Oedipus and the Electra complexes. In other words, loving your parent of the same gender. And the latent stage is little or no sexual motivation present. If you don't successfully get through this, it's emotional calm and intellectual and social exploration. And then genital is the final one. It's about the penis or vagina. It is all about sexual intercourse, and the outcomes impact our sexual relationships. Freud emphasized the importance of unconscious thought and feeling and the role our childhood experiences play in forming our personalities, as well as how we see ourselves and the world around us and everybody else that we interact with. Too little or too much gratification leads to fixations, and those fixations then have an impact on our personalities. Keep in mind, Freud based his theories on what he had learned working with an upper middle class adults, almost entirely women, who sought him out for theory. He believed that sexual impulses ultimately influenced our development. So this is a little bit more about the id and the ego and the superego. The id is present at birth and seeks immediate gratification. It governs the newborn. The superego develops at 5 to 6 years old and has consciousness and should and should not. So it's our conscience, essentially. And the ego aims to find a realistic way to gratify the id and that is acceptable to the superego. So it's like our little referee. We have unconscious motives and inborn urges. And again, here are the stages. You should know these stages. This is an important thing to remember. You will come across this over and over throughout the semester. It's a good idea to learn them now. So a little review. According to Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic perspective of human development, newborns are governed by a hypothetical part of their personality called, I hope you said the id. Erikson had 8 stages of development that grew out of Freud's original work. He saw each stage as a crisis in personality and a major psychosocial challenge that occurred at a critical point in a person's life. In his view, if you successfully made it through the stage and addressed the positive and the negative, with the hope the positive wins, then there is a virtue that comes out of that. So let's walk through these stages. The first stage begins in infancy, and it is trust versus mistrust. And if you make it through it, the virtue you develop is hope. The next stage in early childhood is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And the virtue is will. In preschool, you have initiative versus guilt. And the virtue is purpose. At school age, you have industry versus inferiority. And the purpose is competency. In adolescence, you have identity versus role confusion. And the virtue is fidelity. In young adulthood, you have intimacy versus isolation. And the virtue is love. In middle adulthood, you have generativity, or making your mark, versus stagnation, and the virtue is care. And in maturity, you have ego integrity versus despair, and the virtue is wisdom. A quick review then. Erikson had psychoanalytic development. There are 8 stages across the lifespan. Each stage has a crisis to be resolved, and when resolved, a virtue develops. Balance of the positive and the negative is important, with the positive quality predominating, but the negative is needed. His emphasis is on social and cultural influences. Again, here's the list with the ages in which they occur and the virtues that develop. This is a good time to learn this list. I would try to memorize it if I were you. It will save you a lot of time and effort later in the course. I also thought it might be helpful for a side-by-side comparison of the two. If you look at this side-by-side comparison, it helps you realize the differences between the two. This may be why, if you look at this, you know that there was a joke about Freudian slips, and a lot of jokes about our mothers and what our mothers caused us. Freud focused on psychosocial development, while Erikson focused on psychosocial stages. If you review the table 2.1, there is a side-by-side comparison by age. Erikson believed that family and friends and community who nurture a person are critical for the person's development. He also recognized development as being lifelong. This is important. If you look at this, you will see young adulthood to late teens. Freud did not delineate any further changes after this. But if you notice in Erikson's that the changes and the development continues throughout our life into old age. I would take time to review this table. The next is learning. The next perspective we will discuss is learning. The perspective maintains that development results from learning and is a long learning behavior that results from experiences or adaptation to the environment. Remember, the psychoanalyst then thought of the mind as tabula rasa. Do you remember what tabula rasa means? A blank slate. Therefore, cultural and contextual were of primary importance. The learning theorist also saw development as both continuous and incremental, and that it could be influenced by the environment across the lifespan. Remember, Freud was more focused on childhood and early development. Let's begin discussing behaviorism. Behaviorism has three prominent theorists: Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. Behaviorism is learning theory that emphasizes the predictable role of environment in causing observable behavior. There are two different approaches: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. If we were in class, I would ask you to tell me the difference. Take a few minutes and review this slide. They are lined up here side by side, along with a link where you can go and you can read more about this. Classical conditioning is learning based on associated stimulus that does not ordinarily provoke a response. I am sure you have already heard about Pavlov and his dogs. Pavlov noticed his dogs drooling or salivating when he fed them. He then noticed that they did that any time he came in the room to feed them. Finally, he decided to do an experiment on his dogs, and he rang a bell when he fed them. After a while, the dogs drooled if he rang the bell, even if he didn't have food to give them. It's kind of like my cats. If I go to the kitchen, they ignore me. But if I open a can, they come running. They associate the sound of the can opening with food, and they react to the sound even in the absence of food, which means anytime I open a can of something for me, the cats think it's for them. Of course, I didn't do this as an experiment, but I do find it funny. Watson, on the other hand, experimented on an 11-month-old by making it afraid of furry objects by associating them with the loud sound. This experiment would never be approved today. He believed that he could mold a child into anything he wanted it to be. He showed that fear could be conditioned. It was, and what he did was unethical. So operant conditioning is learning based on an association of behavior with its consequences. The most simple example of this is baby babbling and the mother smiling at the baby. So the baby babbling makes the mother smile makes the baby babble more because it makes the mom smile. It's the positive reinforcement that teaches the baby that making these pleasurable sounds gets mom's attention. Skinner believed that animals and humans will repeat a response that is desirable and suppress a response that's undesirable. So unlike classical conditioning, operant conditioning actually involves voluntary behavior. Let's do a little review and see if you can answer this. A two-year-old child is toilet trained and begins to feel control over his or her body. Now he or she can do things without relying on parents. According to Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, the child is in which stage? If you said autonomy versus shame and doubt, you are correct. Bandura believed that unlike the behaviorists, that learning was bidirectional. From person to the world and from the world back to the person again. He called this reciprocal determinism. Children not only learn by watching others and modeling their behaviors, but they can take the pieces that they learn from others and put them together to form their own styles. As they learn different standards, they are able to judge for themselves and begin to master challenges and achieve goals of developing self-efficacy. The next is cognitive learning. The cognitive perspective is the view that thought processes are central to development. This is how one would apply new information or skills to situations and solve problems. One of the things you often hear in nursing is that you need to think critically, or that it isn't just memorization that is important. Cognitive learning involves comprehension, memory, and application. Cognitive learning theory is divided into two categories: social cognitive theory and cognitive behavioral theory. Two of the theorists in cognitive theory are Piaget and Vygotsky. Piaget was interested in the scientific approach to learning, and much of his work with children is the foundation of knowledge in all of the health professions. He believed children were born with the ability to adapt to their environment and create categories. The child's cognitive growth occurs through three interrelated processes: organization, adaptation, and equilibrium. People put things in categories as a system of knowledge and over time create increasingly complex schemas of thought and behavior that is used in particular situations. He believed learning occurs in four qualitatively different stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. Sensory motor is basically from birth to 18 to 24 months, and that's when you have object permanence. We'll discuss this more later in the semester. Pre-operational is 2 to 7 years, and this is when you have symbolic thought. Concrete operational is 7 to 11 years, and it's logical thought. And formal operational is adolescence to adulthood, and this is when you have scientific reasoning. In each of these stages, we'll go into more detail about what this all means. He believed we organize information by creating categories, and then we further refine these categories. I like dogs. Then I realized there are different kinds of dogs. Boston Terriers and Dobermans, for example. As we mature, we create schemas of ways of organizing information about the world. These get more complex over time. He also thought that we adapt through either assimilation or accommodation. Can you tell me the difference? Okay. Assimilation is taking information and incorporating it into your existing cognitive structure. Accommodation is adjusting your cognitive structure to fit the new information. Essentially, children seek equilibrium. When the world doesn't fit the cognitive structure, you adapt to the world. Sociocultural theory is Lev Vygotsky. It stresses the role of children being actively engaged with the environment. While we learn through social engagement, that engagement is within the cultural context in which we live. Vygotsky believed that adults or more advanced peers are important to help children and to organize their learning before the child could be able to master and internalize the learning themselves. He referred to something called a zone of proximal development to mean the difference between what the child can do alone and what the child will need help to do. As you progress in your nursing and you learn about nursing theory, you will come across Orm's self-care theory, which essentially proposes that nurses only do for patients what they can't do for themselves. I hope you get to the point that you will look back to this theory. You support your patient until they can't support themselves. Well, it's kind of similar to what Vygotsky's saying. He believes that parents, teachers, and others must support a child in learning a task until the child can do it themselves. Remember your parents teaching you to tie your shoes? They didn't just tell you, oh, tie your shoes. They showed you how to do it many times before you were actually able to do it yourself. He referred to this as scaffolding. His theories are especially important to early childhood education and in recognizing the imports of cultural experiences, values, and skills that a child learns. One of the things that's important here is to remember is that scaffolding is even important once you get to college. And you will see scaffolded assignments even in this course. You will see an assignment that builds on another assignment and that gets you prepared for an even bigger assignment. According to Lev Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, sensitive and effective instruction should be aimed at the zone of proximal development. Do you see why I compare this to Orem? Next, we'll talk about contextual perspective. The contextual perspective is the view of human development that sees the individual as inseparable from the social context. John Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory is an important approach to understanding the process and context of human development that identifies 5 levels of environmental influence. You will notice the developing child at the center with micro, meso, exo, and macro systems surrounding the child and interacting. The impacts of the environment surround the child and the ability to affect the development of the child through different characteristics, talents, disabilities, and temperaments is important. Thus, the development of people in different cultures may mean all aspects do not apply to people in other cultures. Here is how to look at this graphic. The microsystem, which is close to the child, is the everyday environment of the child. The mesosystem interlocks with the various microsystems. The exosystem interacts between the microsystem and the outside world. The macrosystem is the overarching cultural pieces here. It's the beliefs, the ideologies, the economic, the political systems. And finally, the chronosystem adds the dimension of time. Let's take a minute and let you think about these. Ask yourself, can you tell me what might be in your microsystem as a university student? Take some time and think about it before moving on. The theory, the evolutionary sociobiology theory, was influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution, and it combines anthropology, ecology, genetics, and more to explain adaptive value of behavior. If you've ever read On the Origin of a Species or The Descent of Man, if you haven't, you should add them to your reading list. The more you know about the great thinkers in history, the more you will understand human development and how we think and learn. Darwin proposed that species develop through survival of the species. Those that survive and reproduce pass on their characteristics in their genes. Over time, there are incremental changes in the characteristics of species. This can be true with behaviors that we developed as protective mechanisms, such as women's aversion to certain foods during pregnancy. Ethnology is the study of adaptive behaviors in animals that have evolved to increase their survival. One example is proximity seeking, where animals stay close to their moms during growth for protection. And this can include the attachment of babies to their moms in humans. So remember, human development that focuses on evolutionary and biological basis, and the ethology, or the study of distinctive adaptive behaviors of species of animals that have evolved to include survival of the species. And I'm sure you came up with many others. The scientific method and quantitative research. This is important. In this course, I want you to clearly understand the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. Here we begin with quantitative research. Let's begin with a few definitions. The scientific method is orderly procedures to gather primarily quantitative information. It is systematic and a rigorous attempt to limit bias. Empirical research is when evidence is rooted in objective reality rather than personal belief. It is what we can observe, thus it is based in empirical evidence. We then gain knowledge through direct and indirect observation. Quantitative researchers gather empirical evidence using a traditional scientific method that is systematic and uses instruments to collect information. They want their research to be generalizable. Generalizability is the ability to generalize the findings to people that are not part of the study. The people doing studies for a new medication want to be able to say it will work for most people in the same way it did for those that participate in the research study. It isn't enough to know, for example, the COVID vaccine works on the people in the study, but researchers want to be able to say it is generalizable to the masses, or equally effective for most people of the same age, for example. One of the problems with quantitative research in nursing is that we deal with the whole person and not just a part of a person. It can be complicated and messy, and I'm sure you know that every day on your clinical unit. What I can do in a lab, looking at one thing, blood pressure, for example, I can't recreate in real life because the person's exposed to all manner of things that don't happen in a well-controlled lab. Let me give you an example. In a well-controlled lab, you have equipment that is just for that experience, that research. It's calibrated on a regular basis. You go in, and before you do the study, you're making sure that everything's working and great, and there's nobody coming in to interrupt you. Now, I'm in the ER, right? And in the ER, I come in. The person doesn't know who's going to be walking in. So it's not a participant in your research you've pre-screened and know everything about. No, this is the random person that walks in off the street. You know what their chief complaint is that they came in for. But while they're giving you their chief complaint in the ER, you have 10 other people waiting. Now, some of those people that came in are probably there and they've been using some type of illicit substance that they shouldn't have been using. So what they may or may not tell you may not be accurate. You're distracted by them. You have a person in another room that's seriously ill and there are all kinds of machines beeping and making noise. You are only divided by curtains and open areas, so you know that there's lots of noise and everything around. Even though there's doors, they're not always closed. And there are people coming and going, asking you for things that may not be related to what you're doing. And while you're experiencing all of this and it's impacting what you're doing with that patient, the patient is also experiencing all of that. It is not the controlled environment of the lab. As nurses, we work in that environment. We do not work in a controlled one. And it's always important to keep that in mind. Let's end this chapter with a view of the steps in evidence-based practice and the steps in the research process. You'll notice there are more steps in the research process. Evidence-based practice starts with a burning clinical question, and we've all had those questions. And those questions usually drive us to look for a way to say, is there a better way to do this? We do this by collecting the most relevant and best evidence, and we just reviewed the hierarchy of evidence. After we have all the articles we want, we critically appraise the evidence to see if there is consistency in what is being said. We integrate all the evidence with one's clinical experience, patient preferences, and values in making a practice decision or change, and then we evaluate that practice decision or change and see if what we did actually worked. The research process is a little bit more detailed because you have to identify an area of interest or a phenomenon, and we previously talked about the phenomenon. We formulate a research question. We then review the literature, select a conceptual model, choose a research design, obtain IRB approval, and next week you will be doing your ethics training, which is a city course. You will collect and analyze data, then you will interpret the results, and you will communicate the findings in writing. This was a very quick overview of some of what we will be covering this semester. We will go into more detail as we move through the